Eric is one of these Valley personalities that begins in science and engineering and is very prominent at Sun Microsystems, and then he becomes a CEO of a software company, and then he is chosen as the CEO of Google, which is only now the hottest company in the world. And it's amazing that anywhere you go in the world, and I go to some of the most off the beaten path places, people have heard of Google and seem to be rooting for it to succeed. It seems to represent something noble about our inventiveness and creativity as a species. Now, of course, as the decades unfold, Google's reputation will be diminished, and it will just become another massively profitable corporation like IBM and Microsoft that have come before it. But now you're still in the flush of this incredible pride and also excitement about what Google will do next. So we're going to kick off with, unless you want to make some sort of opening statement, we'll kick off with the students.
I think that's great. Thank you for that very nice introduction. The rock and the mountain, and then the death by by 1,000 cuts, and then the eventual doom of the corporation. Why don't we do this as a normal press interview? And normally what I would just say is, who would like to have the first question? And any questions are fine.
That goes to me.
Yes, ma'am.
First question. So you've been CEO for over 6 years now. How much longer do you expect to be the CEO of Google?
17 years.
Okay. I mean, is that a definitive answer?
Did you want it more? Do you want it including the months?
Because we were wondering really, what would it take for you to leave?
The board could fire me. But it might be longer than 17 years. When we took the company public, Larry and Sergey and I talked about we have a great business partnership, and I think we are all very much best friends. And so I foolishly suggested that we form our triumvirate for the next 20 years. And so they said, good. And then I did the math as to my own age, and I realized that I'm now committed for another 17 years. But the corporations, of course, the CEO serves at the pleasure of the board. So the real answer is that the board, every quarter, every month, every day, you have an opportunity to be fired or kept.
To kind of move into some of what Google is doing now, I was curious about, Google already offers a lot of the functionality that mainstream social networks offer. Mm-hmm. That can be debated endlessly because the lines are fuzzy, but with the exception of the profile page, the iGoogle page comes pretty close to something that a social network could offer. What plans or reservations does Google have about entering the social networking market?
Google defines its mission as all the world's information universally accessible and useful. It doesn't necessarily mean that all that information has to be owned, managed, created, controlled by Google. In fact, the opposite. And we believe that there will be many, many social networks. There will not be one winner. There'll be broad-scale ones, specialized ones, narrow ones. The technology will enable, and people are very social, very communicative, and so we'll see lots. We, in our normal human existence, physical world, tend to be members of multiple social networks, and you would expect that on the internet as well. Our primary goal then would be to make sure we have access to the information that's in those social networks so that we can include that in our goal to have all the world's information available on queries and with people's permission and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. The company runs a service called Orkut, which is one of the early and very interesting social networks, which is very popular in Brazil and India. And so we have some experience with it. We also have a big partnership with MySpace, and we'd like to do big partnerships with some of the other social networks. And the social networking phenomena is a big one. It's one that's going to stay. It will change in interesting ways. But it's important that we be able to get access to those that information in the social networks, understand what people are doing them, and anticipate their needs.
So Google doesn't have any specific interest in generating their own social network?
Well, as I said, we already have one called Orkut, which I would encourage you to take a look at. It's quite successful.
moving on to the topic of YouTube.
Sure.
Do deals such as the one between Google and YouTube cultivate a dangerous business mentality in the tech industry in terms of a lot of companies might be hoping that Google buys them out?
Well, first place, let's make sure we use the right terms. We bought YouTube. We started by looking at doing a deal with them, and we realized how incredibly successful we said, well, instead of having a business conversation, why don't we have a mergers and acquisition conversation? And YouTube was busy dealing with the incredible growth that they were dealing with, these phenomena take off very quickly. And they felt that the technology, the leadership, the cash, so forth and so on of Google would allow them to achieve their mission. In YouTube's case, it was a place and time. It was the right time for a market leader that is an extraordinary company. It's notable that there were quite a few other companies that didn't get there. And in fact, in the rankings at the time we made the decision, the number 2 site in in video was Google Video. So, and then there were many, many others. So we chose to acquire the company that was the leader and combine the number 1 and number 2. It's a classic business strategy of trying to get an even stronger phenomena going.
Excuse me, would you mind talking about the metric behind buying YouTube?
Well, let me just finish the thought, because I want to make sure I answer your question precisely. So if you then assume that if you found a company, Google will buy you, you have to also say you have to found a company that has to be as successful as YouTube and beat all of the other competitors that are also doing it. So I think the danger that you're referring to are the tiers of venture capitalists who basically see 20 opportunities, but the reality is in these markets there's only 1 or 2 or 3 winners. The majority of the bets in each of these things won't make it, and they are purchased at a relatively low price, if at all. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So back to price, would you mind explaining the metric behind buying YouTube? How much does that break down per set of eyes on YouTube, and how does that equate to the revenues that television networks are making per set of eyes?
Okay. We didn't do it based on television viewership math. We did it based on the end user benefit of YouTube. As part of our due diligence, we knew how much revenue YouTube had, which is not a big number, but we looked at its growth rate and we looked at the social phenomena, and we concluded that we could make money eventually from all of those incredibly happy users. There are lots of ways of making money from a very fast-growing happy user base. The joke, by the way, in the bubble was that this was called URL, which stands for Ubiquity First, Revenue Later, right? So not really the name for it. But we believe that if we can get a very large, very fast-growing user community, there are many ways of making money from it. The specific question you asked was, how did the purchase price break down? And there's no single formula. As part of the acquisition, we do a set of approximations to what we think it's worth, but ultimately the price. And if you ever buy or sell a house, you'll go through this yourself. The price is really what the other person is willing to buy or sell at, and you use the metrics and the calculation to support your intuition that you have a fair price.
Did Google's intuition account for the gaming that's currently going on YouTube right now? If you go to YouTube's site and you look at any one of the videos, top-rated videos, top-viewed videos, there's ads that pop up in the bottom corner of the screenshots, such as supermoviedownloads.com, thegametube.com. Did you guys account for other people gaming YouTube using YouTube's viewership to generate revenue for their own companies?
We did, and the particular stuff you're talking about is a small phenomena. Our primary metric, again, is literally happy end users. And what's very interesting about YouTube, as you asked earlier about social networks, and a good question, YouTube is a social community of a particular kind. And as YouTube gets more and more content, and as citizen programmers, if you will, emerge, people who aggregate content and put playlists together and so forth, the content gets stronger and stronger. There's an old saying about railroads from 150 years ago that the railroads build themselves. That once you start building a railroad and you have something going, it just continues to expand and expand. And we're seeing that with YouTube.
Okay. But you're not at all concerned that the integrity of YouTube is being compromised by these companies coming in and essentially putting videos to the front of YouTube that aren't necessarily the content that the dedicated viewer wants to see?
Well, we always face that. In a search business, you always have the problem of what we call spam, whether it's content spam or advertising spam, people who try to game the system. And the more popular you are, the more people try to use you for their objectives. And they study your algorithms, which we of course don't describe in great technical detail, but they reverse engineer them as best they can. They come up with other attacks. There are now people who think that if you get 5,000 machines and they all link to each other, you can improve your link boost on Google, which might have worked 5 years ago but doesn't work now because we can detect that. So it's a race between the locks, lock makers and lock pickers in that sense. And one of the things that I think that's missed in the discussion about the industry is that it is a competitive barrier of advantage to us to be able to have such a strong position from the standpoint of traffic and content, and also be able to detect that poor quality stuff. And ultimately our computers get smarter and we get better at seeing this is really not what the user was about. We're not perfect at it, but our tests indicate that they were the best in the business at it.
So YouTube doesn't care that a lot of the hits on YouTube are fake?
Well, I disagree with your premise. So again, you're making a statement of fact without having all the details.
Okay.
But we don't release those numbers. So I disagree with your premise, but it's not a problem in aggregate for YouTube.
CBS said though.
Okay, let's go to
Move
the
on.
next one.
Yeah.
As I'm sure you know, the advertising business is incredibly volatile. With Google's interest in several other projects, is it your hope to move Google away from advertising?
Oh, no, to the contrary. We love advertising. The vast majority of Google's revenue is advertising, and advertising is a very, very big market. And let me talk a little bit about why advertising is so important. Advertising is a primary way in which people learn about products, and advertising can be improved. The simplest example is that Google's advertising business, text ads business, used better targeting algorithms so that the ads, when you were searching for a product, they were more relevant. You were more likely to click on them. And by the way, we don't get paid unless you click on them. So a bizarre aspect of this is that we have been showing fewer ads and our revenue goes up. Because if you have fewer ads that are of higher quality, they're worth more in the auction that Google runs. So we like that model. It's very different from traditional advertising. So we are, while it's true that the advertising industry is volatile, so far we have not seen that volatility. I'm not sure why that is, perhaps because people are shifting from less performing advertising models to more. But we have not so far been affected by the ups and downs and so forth. I'm sure eventually we will, but not very much in the short term. The same argument about improving ads, we believe, applies to non-text ads. So we're busy in the display ad business, and there are a number of examples of that. We announced the acquisition of a company called DoubleClick, which is not closed yet for that. We're in the radio ads business. We're doing trials in the television ads business. We announced a big deal with EchoStar, et cetera. A number of other examples. So if you believe that the quality of targeted ads matters, and we do, then that's a big business for us. So I think we'll be in the ads business for the foreseeable future.
Just a quick question, I'll follow up on that. Do you personally, because the business says obviously Google believes in internet advertising, but I mean, do you, really, when was the last time you clicked on an ad on the right side?
You say it as though there's something wrong with it.
Well, because I personally have never clicked on an ad before, so I was just curious who does.
Well, I had the same reaction when I started in 2001. I said, you have got to be kidding. People click on these ads? And the answer is they do. And in the first 6 months, we did a database transition from an older database system to a newer database system. Remember, it's a small company. And I remember when we did the transition, we didn't do the tools right. It was a mistake, which we, of course, corrected as quickly as we could. And I remember talking to the customers and understanding, the people who were the advertisers, who were seeing huge numbers of clicks, and they couldn't figure out how many they were getting and how central it was for their business. So it's a very real business. It's a very defensible and I think a very strong business going forward. So yes, the answer is I do in fact click on the ads, and the ads that I click on are typically at the top because they're the ones that our auction system produces with the highest quality rating.
I wanted to ask a very, very admittedly broad question, but,
Sure.
but one that we think is very important. Google has expanded in a very short time into a seemingly infinite number of markets and sorts of products. Video, social networking, as we talked about earlier, news and media, communication devices such as email. All of these things beyond just the search market. What is Google's endgame? And what is it going for? As you define the company's mission, but where does that mission take you? Does it take you seemingly everywhere?
Well, I think the answer is it takes us very broadly because information is a very large space. I have historically, of course, I worked in the computer industry for a long time, and I was struck by how big the information industry is, because all of us consume information on many devices in many languages, and of course, there's lots of people in the world. So it is a big mission, and Larry and Sergey proposed this mission as they founded the company, so it's not a new mission. So when we say all the world's information, we actually do mean more than just web search. A lot of people assume that Google is just web search because that's how they first encounter it. But there are many, many sources of information that you'd like to get available to you that are not traditional web search. The most obvious one being the information that's in the libraries. Another question for you all is, when was the last time you opened up the traditional yellow pages, right? Well, that information is now in Google and in various forms. So there's lots and lots of information that we have some of, or we have a good amount of. Another example would be maps. There are many countries outside of the developed world where there are not reliable maps of any kind of the cities. So it's a perfectly good project for Google working with user volunteers, citizens of those countries, to try to develop those maps. It's a good thing for the world, it's good for Google, and it helps people use Google more, which is good for Google shareholders in our business.
You've said in previous interviews that Google's Office suite doesn't constitute a challenge to Microsoft.
That is correct.
Why does Google seem so invested in not naming Microsoft as a competitor while launching similar products?
I think you flatter our products. Today, if you look at, first place, you're exactly right that I've been very careful to say that the Google application strategy, as we call it, we don't call it an Office suite, is not to be compared directly to the Office products of Microsoft or any of the others. And I try to avoid talking about specific products, but since everyone asked the Microsoft question, let me just answer it directly. The Microsoft Office product suite has very high market share and is a very mature product. And there's a set of things it does well, and you have to pay for it. And we all know about it, many of you use it. We're trying to solve a different problem. We're trying to solve the problem of the person who wants to keep all of their information somewhere in the network. We call that the cloud. And we want it to be very, very shareable. An example would be Google Calendar. It's very successful for us. Looks like it's the most popular online calendar now after only being in the market for 6 months. And looking at why is the Google Calendar successful, it looks like it's sharing. Calendars are naturally shareable. You share among your family, your friends, your colleagues, among your classmates, what have you. And so the sharing design center of our applications, which are online, is, I think, the key differentiator. If you then say, well, you're offered word processing and spreadsheet and now a presentation manager, they're not at the same level of functionality. They're really for more casual use, more sharing use, and they're different products. And they also happen to be free.
But isn't that dissembling to some degree, because you cite sharing as a feature that, say, isn't as easy with something like Outlook on a network. But that just means that you advanced one sort of feature that Microsoft would probably love to advance themselves.
So it almost seems like a similar product, but the differences you're naming just seem to be improvements.
Well,
For like a new kind of
as
user.
reporters, you're welcome to describe these products in any way you wish. We actually don't use them as a substitute for the competitors' products. We use them in a different way, and that's
Just to
the
sharpen it for
path that we're following.
Are you on a collision course with Microsoft? And that's what
Well-
everybody seems to believe. And certainly Steve Ballmer's behavior suggests that you are out to get them.
I don't work at Microsoft, and I think it's a mistake for me to speculate on their motivations or the people or what have you. I can tell you that we don't primarily focus on any competitor. We don't primarily focus on Microsoft. We're actually focused on building out this new vision. And it may be helpful to try to define the vision and then talk a little bit about leadership. The vision is that you'll be able, on any device that you have, your mobile phone, a BlackBerry, what have you, all the new personal devices, your personal computer, your Mac, to see the same information. And the classic example that I use is, here you are, a student at Stanford, and you drop your Macintosh, and you destroy all the information that's on your hard drive, and you flunk out of school. Right? That would be a bad outcome, right? If you were using that Macintosh, but you had the applications normally stored in the cloud safely and in a replicated way, the way Google does it, you'd be able to go get a new hard drive or whatever you had damaged in your drop, feel a little bit better about it, and get back to work and continue your academic career. It's a very real issue. And this vision, which is easy to understand in a non-technical way, is also the basis of a technical vision, which is generally known as network computing. And there's a new set of technology. The technical term is called AJAX, which is where the application runs on the server. The application runs on the server and the client, but most of the application runs on the server and most of the data is on the server. Now, people like myself have been talking about this stuff for 15 years. This is not a new idea. It's been around for a very long time. So what's different? The mobile devices are now much faster. They have the performance and memory that's required to do that. The networks now are much faster. The mobile networks, even in America, which has been very slow with these regards, is getting to the point where we have roughly a 1 megabit network, which is enough to begin to do video sharing and those kinds of things. So again, it's a different design center. The way I like to do this as a tagline is I like to talk about this as, don't bet against the internet. If you have an older software model, an older hardware model, the internet has trumped most of the industries that it's gone into. And so you need to find a way, in my opinion, to move your customers, your business, and so forth, so that it's consistent with internet principles. And the internet principles would say that most of the data and most of the applications would be on servers. And that's very different from the model that the historic models, and particularly Microsoft's model.
Okay. So the plans you currently have underway to develop a Google iPhone seem to represent a tectonic shift in your ambition. So the question is, how and why did you decide to venture into the hardware market?
Can you describe those plans to me?
Actually,
Well, there is an article that
yeah,
appeared in
there
The
was
Guardian, I believe a couple weeks or a month ago, that described that these things were underway.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you look carefully, you'll see that there was another article later where a different executive said that the article was not correct.
Okay.
We've not made any announcement in that area.
Okay. Well then, so. Okay.
But I mean, it's
Suggestion
Absolutely.
would be you could ask the question differently by saying, what are our plans in the mobile space?
Yeah, yeah.
Because we haven't announced it.
Well, the reason that it had come up as a question is because in like a couple of your recent interviews,
Yeah.
you've really just been emphasizing mobile, mobile, mobile.
Yeah.
And so I can see your push to get Google on mobile devices
Well-
such as the iPhone, but what's to stop you from getting into the hardware market, producing your own?
Well, there's certainly no law that would prevent it. Google is an innovator. So we go back to leadership, and again, we were talking about competitors. You don't lead by copying your competitors. You lead by solving a new problem that affects people that maybe they didn't even realize they had, and that somehow you've solved in a magical way. And in some technology, leadership really looks like magic to people. It's just amazing. And as an example of this, look at the spelling corrector at Google, which works in any language and doesn't use a dictionary. It looks like magic to me. And it's phenomenal. We've had it for years. A simple calculation about devices says that mobile users will be the primary users of the internet over the next 10, 20 years. Relatively straightforward math. There are 3 times as many mobile phones as there are personal computers in the world. The mobile phone growth rate is at least twice that of the personal computer growth rate. So there's not only is it a larger group, but it's also growing faster. the basic phone that is being offered in the third world as well as in the first and second worlds are capable of moderate levels of browsing and moderate searching and those kinds of things. So even at the very low end, it's possible to get reasonable services. And of course, there's a wide variety of these very powerful phones. The Apple iPhone, to say it properly, is a very good example of that, a very, very sophisticated platform. And you should know, as by way of disclosure, that I'm a member of the board of Apple, so I have a conflict there. But the important point here is that the iPhone is the first of a generation of devices that I think will show this mobile model. Google has collaborated with iPhone, and we've announced this, to put Google Maps on the iPhone, and it's just beautiful. It's just a phenomenal product, and hopefully there'll be more collaborations. So we organize our technical teams to try to make all of mobile be more accessible to our information services. Another example would be KDDI, which is the number 2 mobile phone vendor in Japan. We have a very, very successful advertising business with them. People do Google searches on KDDI serviced phones, but we also do targeted ads and we do a rev share with them. So that's another example. So if you look, it's not a single vendor and it's not a single platform. It's really a statement that everyone's going to have mobile phones. There are going to be a lot of different kinds of them. We're building a lot of different kinds of software. And it will vary by vendor, and we'll do deals to get that out there.
Okay, so instead of the hardware device itself, you're looking to disseminate like your search engine information to all those mobile phones.
It's important that Google be reasonably platform independent, so that if you prefer one phone, you still get great use of Google, and if she prefers a different phone, she also gets great use of Google, and the two of you can then have an argument about who has the better phone. But from my perspective, Google is a winner, and you have a choice in all the phones.
So Google will just put information on other companies' phones, but Google will not produce its own phones.
Well, again, I'm trying to be careful not to pre-announce or not announce products.
Right.
So let me not talk about future products, but say that our core strategy is to make sure that no matter what mobile phone you have an excellent Google experience. And by the way, Google is not just search, remember. It's also images and Gmail and maps and those kinds of things.
This is a little bit different subject. Joe Nocera of the New York Times pretty flatly stated that Steve Jobs broke the law in the Apple backdating scandal. Do you agree?
Well, the special committee of which I was a member issued a report which said it did not find that. So the answer is I do not.
Once again, to shift gears dramatically. To go back a couple of years, I'm sure you remember that you were at the center of a highly publicized skirmish between Google and CNET, which resulted in Google temporarily blacklisting CNET from media requests. Looking back, as a company founded on the principle of free-flowing information, what did you learn from that skirmish?
We were having a business dispute with CNET, and we resolved it. And the real lesson that we learned is that anything that we do in a business context will be seen through the prism of many different people's viewpoints. In any case, we resolved the particular dispute, which was actually unrelated to me, and we get along great with them now.
Was the dispute unrelated to the article they ran of Google searching you?
That is correct.
Oh, so, all right.
Yeah.
Pretty good. All right.
One last one
Sure.
as part of this, and then we're going to open it up.
Okay, here you go. In an interview with Fred Vogelstein in November 2005, you said that Google defines its mission, and you also stated it earlier, as all the world's information. And in this particular interview, we choose to work on problems that affect a large group of people and problems that matter. So, in that light, wouldn't Google's acquiescence to allow censorship of user searches in China fly in the face of that mission?
The censorship question, I think, has been the most difficult question that Google has faced internally. The management team, Larry, Sergey, myself, everyone had various points of view, and no one agreed with each other for a fairly long time on how to approach this. So I would say that it's an issue that's worth debating. I think we would say that there are legitimate points of view on both sides, or all sides, I should say, and they're worth being heard. It's not there's a right or a wrong. We ultimately came to the following conclusion. It was better to work with the Chinese than to boycott them with information. It was better to be subject to their law, which we don't like, but on some terms that I'll describe in a sec, because we believe that the Chinese citizens, the users, of which there are many hundreds of millions and eventually maybe a billion, will benefit so much by the information that we could make available that if we were to withhold it, they would not have available. In other words, if you look at the totality of benefit, it's such an important country, such an important issue that we sort of made that trade-off. It's not a perfect outcome. But we made some important decisions. One of the most important decisions was that we were not going to expose user privacy issues in China. So we're very careful to keep user-specific, user-private data outside of China and therefore outside of their governance system. Also, anything that we do that could, if you will, endanger the individuals, and you can imagine the concerns we have there, we fully disclose. And furthermore, if in fact we omit some information, and so you know the amount of information that's omitted, it's a very small percentage. It's 0.1% or something like that. It's a very tiny percentage, but an important part, but a tiny percent, less than a percent. We notify them. And Chinese citizens are very smart, and you can imagine that when they see your result was omitted, you can be sure that they use other mechanisms to get that information that don't involve Google.
Let me just make a quick follow-up. I mean, this sounds like a massive rationalization because, in effect, whatever information the Chinese government needs, they will ask you for. If you don't give it to them, there will be repercussions. So whether you keep that information outside Chinese borders or inside, whether you alert users, the fact of the matter is the Chinese government is going to prosecute its own citizens. It's going to use your service to assist in that. And that's just something you got to live with, because if you're going to do business with the Chinese in China, you have no other choice.
Respectfully, I disagree. There's a treaty between the United States and China that would allow the Chinese government to make a request for information that, if they actually followed all the steps of the treaty, eventually we might get a request from the State Department, and then we would review that as from the prism of U.S. law. I think it's highly unlikely we would do that. So if you believe that China has an emerging legal system, and you believe that they will follow the agreed upon principles, the scenario that you described, where they can arbitrarily make a request of us in the United States, we will not
I
do.
hate to say arbitrarily. Just like law enforcement can make requests of you here in the U.S., law enforcement in China can make requests of you in China.
Well, again, in the specific scenario you're describing, we would, first place, there is a Chinese legal system. It's not perfect, but we would obviously use it. And we're very careful not to put information in China that can be used to harm Chinese citizens. So the scenario that you're describing, there would have to be some way where China chose to harm Google for information that was not itself in China.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not obvious what that scenario would be. We thought about this hard. And there are other organizations that have decided to not be so careful, and we think that was a mistake.
Okay, we're going to switch gears for a second and open this up to the wider group. And we have some significant time left. I want to say that, just as an interlude, that it's true that Google isn't everywhere and everything, but shocking, my own landlord is an employee of Google. I won't mention their name because I am concerned about how, you might decide to put the screws to me through that person, but nevertheless, this is a very good landlord. They have been good to me, but it is true. My own landlord is an employee of Google. Hard to believe.
If it would make you feel better, if it would make you feel better.
That has me more worried about some of these other issues.
The Google servers do not have humans typing at them all the time, telling them what to do. The Google algorithms actually don't really target you personally.
Oh, Lord. So we're going to open up to the wider group now, but the class members themselves can still ask questions as well. And you should say your name when you.
Dr. Schmidt, thank you for
Hi.
visiting us on the farm. It means a lot, you being a cow person. So I just want to say thank you very much. I heard you at Web 2.0, was sitting there in the front row, and your comments were very thought-provoking. And so I reflected on your keynote there. And I am a sommelier artist, chronicling Silicon Valley, Stanford graduate, and I have been running AdWords. For me, my paintings, which are 20,000, 30,000 per item, if you will, that running the campaigns, and I run the campaigns, with the best practices. It's very difficult or very expensive, if you will, to calculate or to estimate the CPC for such a high-cost item. So what I wanted to ask you about was very excited to find out when Google might be offering CPA.
Yeah. Let me ask you a
pricing for
question.
search.
How many of these paintings do you sell a year?
Well, depends. Maybe under 10.
So let's use 10 paintings in a year. So your rough revenue would be 20,000 a painting, so that's $200,000 business. So let's think about the world before Google and then think after Google. So before Google, you have a $200,000 business selling 10 paintings. What would your selling cost be? Well, you'd have to have a gallery of some kind, and that would cost you some money, and you'd have to hire a person, maybe a person and an assistant for when that person's not there, and that kind of stuff. So your selling cost would be pretty high, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
So instead, maybe you'd co-own a gallery with somebody else to defray your selling costs. But I think in all scenarios, you would end up with a selling cost of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, maybe higher. If you remember in balance sheets, sales cost is a pretty big number in the total revenue. So what that would tell you is that you should be willing to give that, less than that, but almost that amount of money to Google. Right?
I would be willing
Yeah.
to do a CPA, because right now to estimate the CPC, it requires millions or billions of clicks,
Yeah.
which prices me out.
Yeah, so it's difficult to know, and this is why we're moving. I'm just using this to illustrate the point that if we can ultimately offer you what is called cost per acquisition, where we literally say, how much are you willing to pay for a purchase, then you would know that it would be worth, for example, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 over a year, and that would be less than your other selling cost. We're developing those tools. They're hard because we have to prove that the click and the user ultimately resulted in a sale. So we're building the components one by one. We have a product called Google Analytics, which allows you to measure the performance of your website. We have a set of ad managers for advertisers, which allow you to watch the progress of the ads. And then we have the tracking and measurement capability that I just described. So I think this year we'll have a sufficiently strong CPA product that you should be able to run the experiment. But what I hope you'll find is that it's not near the cost, but much, much lower cost. And we've had situations, my favorite example is my friend Peter, when I started in the company, called me up and said, I wanted to give you some feedback. And I said, okay, great. He said, well, first place, you have $50 of mine. And I said, how did you get $50? Well, I used my credit card and I used Google AdWords, and I bought the keyword for this quilt that my wife's business built. So I said, great. And he said, yes, and I want you to know I got 50 customers, and I charged $1 per click. And I said, great. And he said, so what's the, I said, well, what's the news? And he said, that's all you're going to get for your lifetime, because she does one a year. Right. So I thought to myself, this is a person who loves making quilts, who has, for literally $1, gotten the customer per year. Now, I'm not sure that every customer would have advertiser would have such a good experience, but it's a great story. And it's also true.
Thank you.
More questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Niraj Sheth. I'm a senior history. I'm be going to journalism after I graduate. And as a senior, I actually have a lot of friends who are going to go work for Google, and I'd say it's possibly by far the company that most people, at least my circle of friends, most people want to go work for. And that leads me to a question about the type of company that Google is. the last few years we've heard a lot about how Google is a different type of company that cares as much about, like you say, the end user as it does about its bottom line, that has a different work ethic for its workers, that cares a lot about the creativity of its individual workers, and it has policies in place to emphasize that. My question is, two questions, I guess. First question, is it fair to characterize Google as a quote-unquote different type of company? And second of all, why do you think that business model has remained unique to Google and that other companies have not necessarily tried to portray themselves or tried to implement policies in the same way that Google has?
A lot of this has to do with Larry and Sergey. And they, when they founded the company, they did not want it to be, quote, a normal, boring company, unquote. And so they are constantly thinking about new ideas and new ways of, sort of keeping me on my toes, if you will, with respect to new ideas. We do over-market it a little bit in that there are plenty of parts of the company which are quite traditional. For example, our financial systems. We manage our cash and our receipt of businesses and our credit terms and so forth like a traditional company. Our facilities, and we have leases with our, leasing vendors. Our telecommunications structure. So there's many normal parts of our business, the infrastructure and so forth, that are very traditional. Our sales force is paid in a relatively traditional way with a base and a bonus, group incentives, that kind of stuff. Where the difference comes in is in how the creative process is managed. And as far as I can tell, Google is the largest non-traditional way in which creative people are managed in the world today. We have rather than telling people what to do, we give them sort of a strategy and then we encourage them to self-organize. And we try to get them into a model which is called 70-20-10, 70% of the core business, 20% adjacent markets, and 10% in other. And we try to encourage engineers in particular to spend 20% of their time on things which are not what their manager has asked them to work on or their team is working on. But we try to encourage them to think independently. I have seen other companies try to copy some of these ideas. They've not done them systematically. It may or may not, first place, we have very strong founder vision on this for obvious reasons, it's their idea. And the second is that the company has high gross margins. So we have money to fund the food and the benefits and the so forth. And because we're so focused on quality people, we would rather have one very high quality person who has tremendous benefits rather than two people who are not as talented and who would soak up the same expense structure. So we spend a lot of money per head. So it's a combination of excellent economics, but even more importantly, a very strong vision that starts with the founders. Go ahead.
Right, so along the same theme, you started as a very successful entrepreneurial company. You're now growing into a big corporation. In the beginning, you have people who sort of, like yourself, started with a small, from the beginning, built up things. Now you have to get in guys who were born in the big company world. You could start by hiring people because you thought they were good guys. Now you have to delegate the hiring of workers. How do you avoid falling into corporate culture?
Well, we worry about this a lot. And by the way, the hiring decisions are still made by the senior executives in the company. So we've not delegated that at all. My experience with people is that they actually work for things other than money and office sizes and so forth. They actually work for a purpose. They work for a bigger cause than themselves, at least the high quality people, the people who we care about, the people who we're trying to get into our company. So anything that we can do on the margin to explain to our current and prospective employees that Google is around a mission, and it's, we think, a good mission and an important mission, and that it matters. And on the margin, the best candidates respond to that, because remember, they get good benefits everywhere, high quality of work life everywhere. In Google's case, because we have also such good economics, we have tremendous computing resources, tremendous networking capability, tremendous technological capability upon which they can build their vision. So that's the pitch that we offer. We worry a lot about the scenario you described where people were very excited when the company was small and now it's a big company and they're bored. And that's where the innovation cycle works, where we try to keep small teams. We're also blessed as a company where it's still possible to do projects in small teams. I mentioned the calendar thing earlier. Calendar was done by 6 people. And they can just sort of take over everything because they can use Google's infrastructure, but it's their accomplishment. They are tremendously proud of what they've done. Most of the projects that I mentioned and the ones that you're familiar with started off as 20% time of one engineer. So you can imagine how proud that engineer, man or woman, is about what they have accomplished by virtue of using the leverage of the base. One of the things about where we are technologically today is that these are scale businesses. And if you were to try to do the same thing in a very small company, you cannot aggregate as much scale quickly to have the level of impact as you can in a company of Google's type. The sum of all of that is how we motivate our employee base and our future employees.
Similarities to the IETF?
Excuse me?
Do you have similarities in the organization to the IETF model of working?
Well, the IETF worked extremely well 10 or 15 years ago, and as the internet became more commercial, the IETF became somewhat more riddled with commercial interests and bias. So I would say that the sharing model and the consultative model of the IETF of 15 years ago is in fact internally how the company is run. Another thing that we do is we try not to tell people what to do. We try to use, the company is run by consensus. There are cases where that fails, so it's not perfect. But a typical example would be we try to get everybody in the room and say, what do you all think? And we try to encourage dissent, because without having a good debate, people don't buy into the eventual outcome. But we also press for an outcome and a decision because we can't take forever. It needs to happen now. More questions? Yes, ma'am.
My name's Kristen Sullivan. I'm a graduate journalism
Hi.
student. And I'd like to ask you a question that may sound like it's a little bit outside your realm of expertise, but I'm interested in your perspective. Major metropolitan newspapers do some of the best reporting still around the world and provide some of the highest quality content on the web, yet they're having trouble generating revenues there. Where do you think they should be focusing their efforts and their money in order to increase the growth rates of their revenues online?
It's a very serious problem, and I agree with your question completely. Newspaper circulation in the United States, I read an article, was down about 16 or 20% over the last 10 or 15 years. So the circulation of traditional newspapers is not going up. In fact, it's going down. So that's problem, the first problem. Second problem is that a fair amount of the revenue to newspapers came out of classifieds. And many people are no longer using classifieds, they're using online services, of which Google is one, but there are many. So it's two problems. There's a readership problem, and then there's a revenue problem in the classifieds. And what's interesting is the demand for news is not gone down. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that people are reading more news. So you have a classic transition shift, which is both technological and economic. The only solution seems to be to get more and more of the assets, these amazing reportorial assets, to be well known in the online world and appropriately compensated. The well known is easy because, as you pointed out, these are voices that are just better, right? They're just better voices. They're just more professional. They're higher quality. Compare the reporting of a very high quality news organization versus some of the things that go on in the blog world, and you can see the difference in what a high quality reporter with a high quality editor and a commitment to accuracy is versus what people do when they're on their own. We've done a couple of things. We built a product which is called Google, essentially it's a Google newspaper ad business. What we're doing is we've taken roughly 100 advertisers and roughly 70 papers, and we're actually creating an ads clearinghouse for additional ads to try to help support their newspapers. And because people are using common ad formats, this is actually an economy of scale. From our perspective, helps the advertisers. That is now in its second phase of a multi-stage test, and this test is going very, very well. So it looks like that's a partial solution. I don't think that's going to be sufficient, and I think the long-term fundamental problem is how do we get more revenue to offset the revenue loss that I'm describing. The only place that I know of for doing that is in monetizing news and personalities and so forth and so on in the online world. Of course, the ad business can do that. There are other ways of doing it with subscriptions and so forth. It's a very, very hard problem and a very real problem for democracy.
I wanted to follow on that topic of Google News that you brought up, because we actually had a head programmer from Google News here a few months ago, and he showed us he took great effort to show us how human hands try to stay off of it as much as possible, so that the algorithm.
Yes, our slogan is "No humans were harmed in the production of this newspaper."
Exactly. And it's, I mean, we could understand the motivation for that, but it also, frankly, terrified us, because news production and reporting and writing is, involves biases, good or bad, involves subjectivity, and that's not always a bad thing. Subjectivity is, in fact, very important in a lot of cases in journalism. How does Google News approach that problem of trying to fairly represent, very complex issues with algorithms that, try to have as little human involvement as possible?
Well, the algorithms have no human involvement. That wasn't always the case. When we first unveiled Google News, I was terrified about what the impact it would have on newspapers, because we didn't want to hurt them. We need their content, right? Newspapers are critical to us because it helps drive our search. So I described Google News to an audience, and a student came up to me and said, "What's your bias?" And I said, "Well, we don't, you didn't understand. We don't have a bias. They're computers." And he said, "Everybody has a bias. You have a bias too." And I said, "No, you're wrong," and pushed him away eventually, and went on. And so I go back to the office the next day, flew back, and I'm talking to the head designer, inventor of Google News, and I said, "Is there a bias in Google News?" And there's this look that engineers get when they don't want to answer the question, but they won't lie to you, and you just didn't ask exactly quite the right question. So I thought, is there any bias in Google News that I should know about right now? And I said, and he looks at me and goes, "Well, yes, of course." And I said, "What?" And he goes, "Cricket." And I go, "What?" He said, "Cricket, the sport cricket." I said, "I've been seeing lots of cricket stories." He says, "Yes, I'm a cricket fan." So I said, "Can you please take this bias out?" So even at Google News, now there's no longer a cricket bias, so not to worry if you're not a cricket fan. It shows you that you have to be really sensitive about this.
But is that something to strive for, to take that bias out, as opposed to confronting the notion that subjectivity may be important?
We do not have good enough algorithms to be able to understand truthfulness, lies, and biases at the level that you as a smart, educated person can. What we can do is we can provide the choices very quickly, and we have to trust people will choose them. We do our very best to using our algorithms, which are very, very clever, to show what's hot, what's exciting. But if, for example, 1,000 people wrote something that was false about Paris Hilton, as opposed to something that was true about Paris Hilton, our computers don't know the truth or falsehood about Paris Hilton, but many other people seem to have an opinion on this question. So we would report the false story just as truthfully, or fervently, if you will, as the true story. Our computers don't know how to make that judgment. It's possible we will be able to develop that. And I'll give you an example that makes a lot of sense. It makes sense that our computers should be able to follow logical reasoning and argumentation, and in particular, claims. So if I say to you, "Did you know that there are more outhouses than TiVos?" Right? This is a factual question. By the way, there are not, just so you know. This claim was made to me by a politician some years ago, so I checked it. It's not true. There are all sorts of statements like that are used in arguments. Did you know that there are more poor people now than there ever were? Well, is that true or is it false? In fact, it's false. So there's a bunch of arguments like that, and we can detect those, and we can probably give you a truth detector, a predictor, or an approximation of where you should spend your time analytically. I don't think we can really give you a left versus right categorization systematically. And I'm not sure that would be good. I think people are very good at looking at multiple sources of information and then deciding what they think. Yes, sir.
My name is Cliff Blickman. I'm also a master's student in journalism. I actually have a personal question for you. You've been very involved in democratic politics, given a lot of money and hosted fundraisers. How do you decide who you're going to give money to and how you're going to get involved? And who are you supporting in 2008?
I have a simple answer, which I've retired. I was very involved with the Clinton-Gore administration in the 90s, part of their high-tech program and so forth, and I've really not been involved since. And I anticipate to stay that way.
Well, we all know that you have a strong engineering background. Not all engineers go into management. What was your decision to go into management? In the very beginning, how did you make that decision?
My best friend was Bill Joy, who was the founder of Sun, and he said we needed a manager. And I said, I'll volunteer. So, and Bill was foolish enough to say yes. And then the rest sort of took care of itself as I made lots of mistakes. And there are people who like to be managers and leaders. I like to be a manager and leader. I think it's an important thing that I want to do very well at, and you can always get better at it. And people they should have the right of excellent leadership. We as a nation should have excellent leadership in our presidency and our Senate and Congress and so forth. Corporations should have excellent leadership. It is something that you can study. It is something that you can do well. The field is evolving, and I became very interested in it. Technology leadership is particularly difficult because technology product cycles move so quickly, and almost all of the traditional literature about management and leadership in traditional industries does not apply very well to technology businesses, which is why technology businesses are so difficult.
Well, on a daily basis, how do you keep yourself up to date?
Well, I use Google. I mean, I use Google News, to be quite honest. It's a great product. I like it a lot. I watch YouTube. I mean, I believe that if you're involved in a company, you should use its products. And of course, we use Google heavily at Google. And what's nice about Google is that Google has so many smart people coming, either as visitors or as employees, that I haven't had to have a new idea in many, many years. Trust me. Right. All the ideas are presented to me in product reviews. And one of the important things about our management of the company is we are constantly reviewing everything all the time. We don't sit around in the office just watching all the people play Frisbee games on the lawn and at the cafeteria. We have teams constantly. What are your issues? How can we help you? Are you operating consistent with the values? We show people what we are doing every quarter. These are objectives. These are things that we care about, and that's the task of management at Google. Go ahead, yes.
Question about something that's been in the news recently with Google that hasn't come up today, but copyright issues. Most prominently with the Viacom lawsuit regarding YouTube content. And more generally about the issues that come up when you have a lot of information that's generated by users, put up by users, that may infringe on copyright issues. What's the strategy for dealing with that?
It's a big problem because users don't behave the way they're supposed to sometimes. So you can have, for example, people who will violate copyright law and upload a picture or a video or what have you, and they think it's okay. They're either not aware of the law or they disagree with it. And the laws also vary by country. Now, Google is primarily subject to U.S. law, so we are very sensitive to that. But the laws, for example, on copyright infringement are different in Europe, which is where we have a major operation, than they are in the United States. So the first answer is we have a whole crew of lawyers who then enter the conversation. And we spent a lot of time looking at this, and there's this thing called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, which roughly says that if you're a company like Google and someone posts something or transmits something to your network, you don't have responsibility for the violation until you're told about it, and if you're told about it, you have to act quickly to remove it. So those are called takedown policies. Now the specifics here are important, and they're in dispute. And Viacom has managed to sue Google for $1 billion over some of the details here, which I shouldn't comment on. But the lawyers, and we have many, are really quite convinced that the DMCA is the law of the land and that Google is meeting it. Whether we believe or disagree or what have you with the specific terms don't matter. We are subject to that law, and we must and we do follow it. One of the criticisms is that somehow the DMCA should be changed. Google's not in charge of that. If the laws be changed, there'll be a process. As we know, laws are go through our governments, signed by the President of the United States, whoever that might be. So we'll see if that happens. But in the meantime, we're subject to those laws, and we're going to adhere to them. It's messy because not everyone agrees with what I just said, even though I know it to be true. And the second, as I mentioned, is it varies by country.
Do you think, in your opinion, do you think the law should be changed in an age of user-generated content in cyberspace?
The DMCA was very hard fought. I was part of the, and in fact, the primary requesters for the DMCA were in fact the copyright holders in 1996. So it's curious that some of those groups would now ask that it be weakened, when in fact they fought so hard for it. And maybe that's just the fact that it was a balance of interests. It's not a perfect solution for either one. So I personally do not think it would be a good idea to change the DMCA. I think that any such change would affect so many people who are benefit from it, in particular the internet service providers, all of the content hosters, all the websites and so forth, who operate under that legal structure today. And it could, if it were materially changed, it could have a big impact on content production, authoring, and electronic commerce.
We'll have one or two more.
Go ahead.
questions.
Yes, sir.
Turos, greeting scholar from Finland.
Yes,
We're
hi.
here with David Nordfor's Innovation Journals program. I would like to very much to hear about your insights about the future for journalism.
Sure.
Because it's in deep trouble just now. Thousands of layoffs inside this country and all over the world. So how do you see?
Is it true in Finland as well?
Not that much. Not that much.
So maybe that's a better system.
Well, the Google is not working that well.
To the contrary, I think Google works very well in Finland. So I don't know. Yeah, no, we have a very good operation there. Let's talk about the role of journalism, and let's talk about the importance of information. The role of citizen journalist is going to go unbelievably stronger. Simplest example is that eventually it'll be possible to use your mobile phone as a video camera, and it'll be possible to take that video and put it on sites like YouTube very easily. Makes perfect sense, right? So all of a sudden we're going to have millions of people who will be seeing things that they like or don't like and posting them. Obviously, from our perspective, this is a good problem because we're in the search and sorting algorithm, and we're very good at ranking and figuring out what's better and what's less important based on your need. So from our perspective, this vision is very good. From a journalist perspective, it makes life almost impossible because they have so much that they have to sort through. I don't think there's going to be a replacement for the traditional journalistic role, where the journalist is literally investigating something. But I think the mechanisms that they use will be quite different. They will obviously use the web. They'll survey user-generated content to see what people are claiming. But the journalist, the smart journalist, will understand that even that system can be gamed. That it's possible, for example, that if I'm not this, if I were, for example, a liar, I could make a fake video and I could promote that as true, and I could create a whole wave of communication. Well, we were upset in the political process with political spin. But now imagine that corporations, illegally by the way, started to do that, or governments, aside from ours, decided to do it, again, illegally according to our laws and customs. So it's perfectly possible that not only will there be a lot of information, but there'll be a lot of misinformation. And we struggle with this question of how do you know that the information you're getting is accurate or not? And the only systematic way we know of is the wisdom of the crowd, the ranking. So a simple example is that I wanted to know how long I was going to live. I figured that was the most interesting query I could ever do. What is my lifespan? And so up comes a calculator. There's a lifespan calculator that some person put up, and I put in, and I didn't like it, and I changed the input, and I eventually got a longer age, and I was happy, and I said, that's it, I'm done. Our ranking algorithms looked at all the lifespan calculators and got the one that was most effective because of the combination of ranking and relevance and comprehensiveness that Google does. The same thing will probably work with respect to all of the inputs and information in the newspapers. At the end of the day, investigative journalism, which I think is what many of you are training in, will involve a very smart reporter who's not willing to take no, and who's willing to deal with people who don't want to, who are in important positions, who don't want to give he or she information, and they'll find ways of getting information that's truthful and accurate. And that's an important part of our system. And I think it's an important part of the world. I think that one of the great things about the internet is that even bad journalists benefit from the internet because at least they can be heard. Right? At least the information is at least present, whereas in many countries it's not been present at all.
Can I follow up on that for a second? I'm Frank Cole, and I'm teaching journalism here this year after spending 27 years at the Washington Post. And came here as definitely part of the turnover in journalism business, so I'm both a beneficiary and a victim of Google, and a great fan on one level. But
and by the way, Washington Post is our first news partner, I should add.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. But a couple of things that concern me about this, the way you describe the coming world, is it strikes me that the problem with the logarithm system isn't so much misinformation, but that it tends to reward the lowest common denominator of news, so that unique kinds of news, and the kind that we're talking about encouraging, actually become discouraged in a system that's arithmetically based. And at the same time, even though you're beginning to make deals with news organizations, the fact is that Google pretty much gorges on free news. And so in those two ways, it seems to me you're undermining the kind of goal that you're looking for and that we would all agree with.
Well, as I mentioned, it's an important issue. I disagree with the way you expressed it, but I do agree that it's an important and it's a shared problem. A couple of observations. I think that as our algorithms get better, we should be able to sort the copies and the poor quality work with the things that are unique and really notable. We won't necessarily be able to determine if your notable work is better or worse than his notable work, but we should be able to say, these are all kind of similar, and this one is really quite different, which I think is a lot of what you're talking about. And we may ultimately be able to get at least a little bit along the way of judgment, although I don't think, certainly for a long time, will we be able to come anywhere near the kind of judgment that someone like yourself can do. With respect to the question of using the content, all of the organizations that we use content from do so willingly. And in fact, there's a simple mechanism, if you don't want your content to be part of Google, to eliminate it. It's called robots.txt. And all of the people who we have talked with have said, we want you to use more of it, because what Google does is it drives traffic to the Washington Post site, to the New York Times site, to the Associated Press site, so forth and so on. So by driving traffic to those newspapers, they believe that we are helping them in their transition to add an online marketplace, online ad network. And they're voting with their feet, and they clearly have a free choice. So I know that they believe this. They may not like it, but I know that they believe it.
Well, yeah, they don't much like it, but they don't feel they have any choice. Actually, it's not a free choice. It's Google or the highway.
Well, again, it's important to know that people whose information is in Google, who are the people who promulgate that information, the people who operate the websites, have a choice as to whether Google uses that information or not. If you don't want your information in Google, we will not show it. Most people, and as I said, the vast majority of people would much prefer to get the traffic, and then as the person comes to their site, you've got a pretty interesting person. You've got somebody who's reading your content, they're intelligent, they're interested in your area, and maybe there's a way where you can sell them a product or sell them a subscription or promote your brand or something like that.
Well, listening to these last questions, Eric, I began looking around the room for your bodyguard. I don't know.
You're dressed like it.
I will be. Yes, that's right. I'm moonlighting. Well, the Stanford fee is not high enough for me, so I'm packing today, and we'll walk you out to your car, protecting you. Look, these were terrific questions, and I was very impressed, both for the class and the wider
you guys did a great job.
group. Yeah.
Okay.
I want to thank Ann for this great room, and Grimes, the chief of the department, and also thanks a lot to the students. Eric was patient and really generous, and you didn't disappoint us, and I really want to thank you so much. I know we got a lot more out of it than you did,
No,
but you at least get, what, a souvenir film of the event.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.